My name is Joseph, son of Jacob. From the splendor of my father's favor, marked by a multicolored coat, to the day my brothers sold me into slavery, my life has been shaped by both devastating betrayals and miraculous blessings. Through it all, God's hand never left me. Come with me as I recount how those twists of fate led me from the depths of a foreign prison to a position of great influence, and ultimately, to a profound story of forgiveness and reconciliation. In a second I'll turn on the dark screen and I invite you to get comfortable as you prepare for sleep. Listen to the gentle rain sounds in the background as you listen to my story. But before we begin, I would really appreciate it if you'd give me a like on this video and subscribe to join our community. Then comment below where in the world you are listening to my story from. Feel free to share some of your story too if you want. Okay. I'm about to open the scroll of my memories to share with you the story of how one young dreamer went from the depths of despair to a place of profound purpose. Let us begin. I look back now and recall my earliest years with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. My name is Joseph and my father was Jacob, also called Israel. I grew up surrounded by my many older brothers, the sons my father had before me. In those days I was the favored child, something that seemed only natural to me then but which I now understand was a source of deep pain for my siblings. It was not that my father disliked his other sons. Rather, he loved me with a particular tenderness that might have come from his special love for my mother, Rachel. As a boy, I assumed this devotion was the way of things, never suspecting that my brother's sidelong glances would one day spell heartache for us all. I was too young and too naive to question my place in the family. Instead, I basked in the warmth of my father's attention, never guessing that it could become an icy wedge between me and my kin. I remember the day my father presented me with a magnificent coat, woven in bright, vibrant colors that glimmered in the sunlight. It was more than just clothing. It felt like a declaration, a statement to the entire household that I held a cherished position in my father's heart. Whenever I wore that coat, my brother's eyes would flicker with something I didn't yet understand. It was an uneasy blend of envy, irritation, and weariness. At the time, I thought they might just be admiring the coat's craftsmanship. But as the months went on, I began to sense that their silent stares were laden with discontent. Still, I was young and headstrong. I delighted in showing off this gift, swirling the robe about me with pride. If only I had known the seeds of discord it was sowing. My father's favoritism was not the only sign of what I believed to be a blessed destiny. From a very young age, I experienced dreams so vivid, they felt as if they were messages whispered from the heavens. In one dream, I found myself in a field with my brothers, each of us binding sheaves of grain. Suddenly, my sheaf rose upright, while theirs circled around mine and bowed low. I awoke breathless, certain that it was no mere fancy but a sign of something profound. Eager and excited, I could not keep such a marvel to myself. I recounted every detail to my brothers, describing how their sheaves seemed to bow before mine. I expected they would share in my wonder or at least be curious. Instead, their faces hardened, and they questioned if I was suggesting that one day I would rule over them. Such a reaction did not discourage me. Perhaps I was too blinded by my youthful enthusiasm to notice how deeply it stung them. I dreamed again, this time of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, all bowing down to me. I announced this dream at the family table, my hands trembling with excitement. My father's brow furrowed in concern. Had I no sense of restraint? My brothers were glaring, their expressions dark and unreadable. Even my father, who loved me dearly, asked if I believed he and my mother would also bow before me. Yet I could see something flicker in his eyes, something like curiosity or caution. He did not dismiss my dreams entirely. He simply stored them away in his heart. As for my brothers, any doubt they might have had about their growing resentment now crystallized into outright hostility. Life continued in the routines of our family, but the air between me and my brothers felt charged. They worked in the fields, tending the flocks, while I stayed closer to our father, often helping with tasks around the tents or learning from him directly. Whenever I did venture out to join them, I was keenly aware of a thick tension. Their laughter would quiet as I approached, and their conversations shifted to guarded tones. I tried to brush aside these uneasy feelings. I was their younger brother after all. Surely they would protect me if danger arose. But even then, I had moments of clarity, fleeting glimpses of a coldness in them. I told myself it was just my imagination. Though I sensed their disapproval, I still clung to an innocence that believed all would be well. There was, in my mind, no possibility that the family bond we shared could truly break. I admired my father greatly, and I assumed my brothers did the same. I thought that whatever bitterness they felt would pass in time. Perhaps if I had been less vocal about my dreams, the friction might have eased. But my sense of calling felt too strong to hide. I carried these visions within me as if they were glorious secrets, gifts from God that I was meant to share. I had no idea that these very words, which I believed were a testament to my destiny, were stirring up the seeds of disaster. As the seasons turned, my father would sometimes ask after the welfare of my brothers, who would be off grazing the flocks. In those instances, I did not hesitate. I would travel to find them, full of innocence and determination to bring back a good report. I wandered across fields and valleys, never doubting for an instant that I was welcome. This too was part of my youthful assumption, that my brothers, though sometimes stern and distant, still cared for me in their own way. I might recall the shadows of discontent in their eyes, but it did not occur to me to suspect the depths of their bitterness. Looking back, I realize how my father's affection and my own grand dreams made me careless of the tensions I was stirring. Though I was learning the ways of shepherds and growing in my responsibilities, I was still very much a boy, caught up in visions of a radiant future. I could not yet understand the gravity of the envy growing in my brothers' hearts. My father would shake his head at times as if he foresaw trouble ahead. But he never withheld his love, never dimmed his praise for me, and never discouraged me from speaking of my dreams. He might have worried, but he was also proud of the son who, in his eyes, was destined for greatness. I sometimes wonder if there were moments in which my brothers tried to see me as just a child, naive and unaware. Perhaps if I had spoken less about rising above them, if I had only realized how my words fed their anger, we might have come to some understanding. I was blind, or maybe simply too caught up in my wonder. I believed these revelations of bowing sheaves and celestial bodies were meant to be shared. Now, I know they were signposts of what lay ahead, but at the time they only added fuel to the fire. Still, I cherished those dreams. Even when my brothers scoffed, I felt God's presence in them, as though He was whispering promises into my young heart. There were nights I would lie awake, gazing up at the stars, thinking of how one day I might stand in a place of honor. The idea thrilled me. In my youthful arrogance, I did not question whether I was prepared for such responsibility. I simply assumed that it would unfold naturally. Faith, to me, was trusting that what I saw in my dreams would come to pass in its own time. Yet I did not anticipate the winding road that would lead from those quiet nights under a canopy of stars to a journey I could never have imagined. So, here in my later years, I remember the day my father draped that richly colored coat upon my shoulders. I remember the way my brothers' stony faces tightened, how a chill ran through the air despite the warmth of the sun. It is like watching a scene from a distance, understanding now what I could not comprehend then. My words about those bowing sheaves, my talk of the sun, moon, and stars, were like kindling, waiting for a spark. And though I could not see it at the time, the spark would soon set my life ablaze in ways both terrifying and miraculous. Those dreams, so full of promise, were about to carry me into the darkest of nights. It was there, in that impending darkness, that I would learn the true meaning of faith. But in that moment, young, proud, and certain of my destiny, my heart swelled with anticipation. I felt no caution, only the thrill of believing that God Himself had set me apart. Little did I know that my journey was only just beginning, that the gentle slopes of our homeland would soon give way to unfamiliar territories where my faith would be tested at every turn. For now, I was a dreamer, a favored son in a family that was about to fracture, unaware of the pit, the chains, and the foreign land that awaited me. And so my story truly begins with a coat of many colors, a child's unbridled excitement, and the gathering shadows of a fate none of us could have foreseen. I remember the day my father called me aside and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. His eyes shone with a worry I couldn't quite place. He told me to go and check on my brothers, who were tending our family's flocks some distance away. At the time, I did not think it strange that he asked me, rather than sending one of his servants. My father trusted my accounts. I had always brought him honest reports, even when they did not favor my brothers. I recall my father's parting words, "Be careful, my son," echoing in my mind as I set out, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. The morning sun bathed the fields in a warm glow, and I began my journey with a light heart. My colored coat, which my father had given me, fluttered around my ankles. Though I had sensed my brother's resentment in the past, I still believed in the strength of our familial bond. Perhaps I was naive to think they would be pleased to see me. I walked through the countryside, humming quietly to myself, imagining how I would greet them. In my mind, I pictured us returning together as a family to share a meal under our father's tent. When at last I reached the area where my brothers were supposed to be, I found only the echo of wind rustling through the grasses. Growing uneasy, I asked a passerby if he had seen them. He pointed further along the way toward Dothan, so I pressed on, determined to fulfill my father's request. My heart quickened with every step, a strange sense of foreboding settling in my chest. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that my brothers might only have moved the flocks. Yet a whisper of doubt echoed through my mind, and I could not quiet it. As I crested a small hill, I spotted them in the distance. They were gathered near a cluster of rocks, the sheep grazing in scattered patches of grass around them. A wave of relief washed over me at first, glad to have finally found them. But as I drew closer, I noticed they were watching me. Their postures grew rigid, and they stood in tense silence. I raised a hand in greeting, calling out, "Brothers," with what I hoped was a warm smile. Instead of answering me in kind, I saw their eyes flicker with something dark, like a warning I failed to heed. Before I had time to wonder at their expressions, hands seized me from behind. Rough, calloused fingers gripped my arms, twisting them painfully. Startled, I cried out, but my voice was muffled by a surge of bodies crowding around me. I caught glimpses of my brothers' faces, grim, determined, cold. My heart pounded wildly as panic began to bloom inside my chest. In a sudden swirl of confusion, they stripped off my beloved coat, tearing it from my shoulders as if it were a thing of contempt. I gasped in shock, but words would not come. Their voices, low and seething, buzzed around me like a swarm of angry bees. "Look at him, this dreamer," one hissed. "Father's little favorite," spat another. Every syllable dripped with hatred that I had been too blind to see before. I tried to protest, but they refused to listen. It was then that I realized this was no mere prank or roughhousing. Their anger burned like a fierce flame. I felt the weight of their resentments pounding into my very soul, and fear took hold of me with an iron grip I could not break. Suddenly, they shoved me toward the edge of a deep pit, its darkness yawning like an open mouth in the earth. My legs stumbled against the rim, and before I could regain my footing, I tumbled into the depths below. My breath left me in a harsh gasp as I hit the hard ground, pain radiating through my body. The walls around me were damp and earthen, and when I looked up, all I could see was a sliver of sky framed by their angry faces. The taste of dust clung to my tongue, and my mind spun with disbelief. How could my own flesh and blood do this? I pleaded with them from the bottom of that pit, my voice cracking with terror. "Please let me out," I called. "Have mercy, brothers." But their silhouettes remained unmoving against the light. I heard snippets of their conversation drifting down, talk of killing me, of ridding themselves of the child who had dared to claim that one day they would bow to him. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized the depth of their hatred. Tears burned my eyes, and I pressed my palms against the cold earth, sobbing quietly, wondering if this would be my tomb. Time stretched in that darkness, my senses magnifying every sound above. I heard footsteps scuffling at the pit's edge, low murmurs, and then one voice urging that they should not kill me outright. I recognized Reuben, who seemed uncertain, suggesting perhaps they should leave me in the pit instead. For a moment, a spark of hope flared in my chest. Maybe they would relent and simply teach me a lesson. Yet even with Reuben's reluctance, I felt no comfort. My other brothers sounded determined to be rid of me for good, and I remained imprisoned, unable to save myself. At some point, I heard the distant rumble of approaching travelers. Camel bells jingled, and voices in a foreign tongue drifted on the wind. From the scraps of conversation I could catch, my brothers had spotted a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passing by. The men were heading toward Egypt with their wares. When my brothers discussed selling me, my stomach lurched as if I had been struck. I pressed my hands against the pit's rough walls, trying to climb out in desperation. My fingers slid uselessly in the loose dirt, and a sob rose in my throat. The betrayal was complete. They were willing to trade me for silver, as if I were livestock rather than their own kin. I remember them hauling me out of the pit, my arms and legs trembling so fiercely I could barely stand. I tried to meet their eyes, to find some hint of compassion or regret, but all I saw were faces set like stone. Judah's voice echoed in my ears. "He is our brother, our own flesh, but we should not kill him. Let the Ishmaelites have him, and we will be rid of him forever." My pleas caught in my throat as the traders grabbed me. My wrists were bound, and the coarse rope dug into my skin. I felt as though I were caught in a nightmare from which I could not awaken. The Ishmaelite merchants examined me as they might a piece of merchandise, prodding and checking for any sign of defect. My heart raced with dread, yet I could not muster the strength to resist. I looked desperately at my brothers, searching for someone to intervene, but they turned away from my gaze. A few silver coins exchanged hands. The jingle of metal filled my ears, and I knew that I had been sold. Anger, terror, sorrow, they all welled up inside me, threatening to consume me. I wanted to scream, to curse them for what they were doing, but all I could manage was a choked whisper. When the traders led me away, the rough rope biting into my wrists, I called out one last time for my brothers to remember who I was, begging them not to abandon me. They did not reply. It was as if their hearts had turned to ice. Each step away from home felt like 1,000. Dust clung to my cheeks, mixing with tears I could no longer hold back. My body shook, not from cold, but from the sheer horror of what had happened. My world had shattered. I had gone from a beloved son to a slave with no certainty of tomorrow. I wondered in that moment if God could still see me. The dreams I once cherished flashed before my eyes, the sheaves of grain bowing to mine, the sun, moon, and stars paying homage. How hollow those images seemed now, as I stumbled forward under the watchful eyes of foreign traders. My pleas had fallen on deaf ears, and I was left questioning why God would allow such cruelty. Yet, in the midst of my anguish, a faint whisper of faith clung to me, reminding me that even in the darkest place, the Almighty's hand might still guide me. Though the road stretched out before me with uncertainty and fear, I held fast to the faint hope that I was not truly alone. That day stands out in my memory as the moment everything changed. The bond one believed was unbreakable had been severed by jealousy, resentment, and greed. I had no idea what awaited me in Egypt, only that I had lost all that was dear: my family, my freedom, and the life I once knew. With each dusty step, I felt my heart clench in sorrow. I was Joseph, sold by my own kin, betrayed by blood. My journey into the unknown had begun, and I could only pray that one day, I might find an answer to the agony that now consumed me. I remember how the landscape changed gradually as we traveled farther from home, the rolling hills of my father's land giving way to wide stretches of desert under a scorching sun. The traders who had bought me wasted no kindness on a Hebrew boy, and I soon learned the harsh reality of my position. Day after day, I trudged behind them, ankles and wrists chafed by rough bindings. My body ached, and my throat felt parched from the relentless heat. I tried to keep my mind focused on the memories of home, my father's gentle voice, the laughter of my youngest brother Benjamin, but all too often these thoughts gave way to despair. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw my brothers' faces, cold and unyielding as they bartered me away. Even so, some distant spark of faith pressed me onward, reminding me that God was still with me even in the desert. When we finally reached the outskirts of Egypt, the sight before me was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Towering structures of stone rose against the sky, while busy roads teemed with caravans and laborers. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, spices, baked bread, sweat, and smoke from countless fires. In my father's tents, life had been simpler, quieter. Here, everything moved at an urgent pace, and I felt as though I had stepped into a different world. My captors spoke in hushed tones about the prices slaves could fetch in the markets of Egypt, glancing my way as if weighing my worth. I lowered my head, aware that I was about to be sold yet again, the last remnants of my freedom slipping from my grasp. Eventually, I found myself standing in a crowded market, surrounded by men with hardened eyes. They prodded at me, checking my muscles, my teeth, my endurance, as though I were no more than livestock. Shame and fear burned within me, but I swallowed them down. Despite the ache in my heart, I resolved to stand firm in the faith my father had taught me. The words of our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, echoed in my mind. He would never abandon his people, no matter how dire the circumstances. Still, it was difficult to cling to that promise in the face of so many leering strangers. Among those who inspected me that day was a man named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's guard. He was a powerful figure, and though I could not understand everything he said, I recognized that he commanded respect. His gaze lingered on me, and I sensed an air of calculation in the set of his jaw. When he spoke, the traders snapped to attention, nodding and gesturing. Within moments, a handful of coins exchanged hands. Just like that, I was his property. My heart pounded as I followed him out of the marketplace, flanked by guards who offered me no comfort but at least refrained from the cruel jabs I had grown accustomed to on the journey. I wondered if I had simply traded one prison for another. Potiphar's house stood within an impressive compound in a bustling quarter of the city. High walls surrounded courtyards filled with exotic trees and murmuring fountains. Everything was larger and more ornate than anything I had seen before, reminding me of my lowly status. From the moment I stepped inside, I was put to work carrying water, sweeping floors, and cleaning whatever corner I was assigned. The servants' quarters were cramped, and I shared my space with others from different lands, each with stories of loss and survival. At first we rarely spoke. Suspicion lingered in the air, for trust was a scarce commodity among slaves. Still, in time, we exchanged small words of comfort, forging a tentative bond in the midst of our shared hardship. The days blended into weeks and the weeks into months. I labored from early morning until late at night, my muscles sore and my spirit weary. Yet, somewhere deep within me, the memories of my father's God provided flickers of hope. I recalled the dreams I once had, visions of grain sheaves and heavenly bodies bowing down. Those dreams felt far away now, almost foolish to cling to in my current condition. And yet I could not let go of the possibility that those dreams had meaning beyond my understanding. Each morning, I rose with a silent prayer on my lips, asking the Almighty for the strength to do my tasks well, to retain my integrity, and to trust that I was not forsaken. Slowly, I began to notice something. Despite my circumstances, I was finding small graces. Whenever I finished my duties, I would double-check them, ensuring every corner was spotless, every jug filled. My fellow servants grumbled that I worked too hard, but I believed that doing each task as if unto God Himself was the only way I could hold on to my identity. Word of my diligence traveled through the household, eventually reaching Potiphar's ears. One afternoon he summoned me to a part of the house I had never seen. My heart pounded as I entered a spacious chamber adorned with fine linens and gleaming lamps. Potiphar stood there, imposing and stern, yet there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He questioned me through an interpreter, asking about my homeland, my family, and my abilities. I answered as honestly as I could, though I left out the painful details of how I came to be sold. Potiphar listened intently, nodding from time to time. Then, without warning, he instructed one of his attendants to place me in charge of certain household affairs. My hands trembled as I realized he was entrusting me with responsibilities far above a common slave station. It seemed that my reputation for diligence had worked in my favor. Though I did not fully understand it, I sensed that God's favor was upon me, guiding me in this foreign land. In the weeks that followed, I assumed more duties within Potiphar's estate. I managed the storage of provisions, oversaw the comings and goings of other servants, and was even asked to maintain records of certain expenses. With each new assignment, I strove to prove myself worthy, mindful that a single mistake could cost me everything. Yet it felt as if a veil had been lifted from my life. No longer was I confined to the lowest rung in the household. I was entrusted with tasks that demanded integrity, intelligence, and care. Though I was still a slave, I found a seed of hope taking root in my heart, nurtured by my growing sense that the Lord was with me in this place. The loneliness still gnawed at me, of course. At night, lying on a mat in a modest chamber, my thoughts would wander to my father and my younger brother Benjamin. Did they believe I was dead? Had my brothers concocted some story to explain my absence? And if they had, what anguish did my father endure, thinking he had lost his favored son? I tried not to dwell on these thoughts too long, for sorrow would threaten to overwhelm me. Instead I prayed. In those moments, prayer became the one thread connecting me to the life I had known. I prayed for my family that they might be safe. I prayed for my own heart, that it would not harden under the weight of betrayal. And I prayed for guidance, trusting that the God who had given me those childhood dreams still had a plan for me. Little by little, my duties expanded. Potiphar seemed impressed with my ability to organize and maintain order. He began to rely on me, confiding certain matters to my discretion and praising my commitment to honesty. The other servants regarded me with a mix of respect and wariness, but gradually a few became friends, especially those who worked closely alongside me. I realized that in this strange land, where I had been brought against my will, I might still live a life that honored God. Even as I remained bound by the chains of slavery, my soul felt a measure of freedom in knowing my service pleased the Lord and my master alike. Looking back on that period, I recognize it as a time of testing, my faith refined by unfamiliar trials. I had entered Egypt in chains, terrified and forsaken, yet now I found myself managing a powerful man's household. Though the memories of betrayal still haunted me, and the ache for my home remained, I discovered that God could bring a measure of good out of even the darkest circumstances. Each day, I woke with renewed determination to be faithful, to show kindness whenever possible, and to trust that all my steps were directed by a higher hand. In those moments when hope began to blossom again, I recognized that I was changing. My heart, once swollen with pride and youthful dreams, was now tempered by adversity and guided by a humble reliance on the one who never leaves us, no matter how far we stray from the land of our birth. In those days, as I rose through the ranks of Potiphar's household, I believed I was truly starting to understand my purpose here in Egypt. Despite my circumstances as a slave, my responsibilities had grown, and with them came a sense of accomplishment. I managed accounts, oversaw provisions, and supervised other servants with an attention to detail that Potiphar valued. This new position, however, also brought me closer to the inner workings of the household, including members of the family I had previously only glimpsed from afar. Among those who took notice of me was Potiphar's wife, a woman whose gaze lingered far too long whenever we crossed paths. At first, I thought little of it. She was my master's wife, and I assumed she observed me only to confirm that her husband's affairs were in capable hands. Yet before long, I felt an unmistakable tension in her presence. Her eyes tracked my every move, and she would find reasons to speak with me, sometimes drawing me aside to ask questions about trivial matters. Over time, these interactions became less guarded. A certain boldness seeped into her voice, and I soon realized her intentions were anything but innocent. It began with subtle flattery, a remark about my diligence, a lingering glance at my face, an offhand comment on my appearance. Despite my youth, I recognized the danger in her tone, the way she leaned in just a little too close when she spoke. Each time, I tried to redirect the conversation back to matters of the household or to suggest that she speak with Potiphar directly if she had concerns. My heart pounded each time I extricated myself from her presence, uneasy and wary. I was determined to remain honorable and true to the God I served. Still, I was but a slave in this household, and I could not simply demand that Potiphar's wife cease her advances. The imbalance of power weighed heavily on my mind. She was accustomed to getting what she wanted, and I was in no position to defy her overtly, lest she invent some reason to punish me. Day by day her attempts grew bolder. She would find me in the corridors or near the storerooms, contriving reasons to speak privately. If I said I had tasks to attend to, she would order me to stay. If I stood at a distance, she would move closer, lowering her voice and giving me sidelong glances that made my skin crawl. My spirit struggled in that tension between duty to my master and the fear of offending his wife. Yet above all, I could not betray my faith in the God who had guided me this far. Had I given in to her, I would have sinned not only against Potiphar but against the Almighty himself. I remember one afternoon in particular, when the household was uncommonly quiet. Potiphar was away on business for Pharaoh, and most of the other servants were scattered about on their daily errands. I had remained behind to complete an inventory of the storeroom, checking supplies and ensuring everything was accounted for. The warm breeze through the open shutters did little to calm my nerves when I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned to see Potiphar's wife standing at the threshold, her jewelry catching the faint light from the hall. She regarded me with an intensity that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. She approached, her voice low and coaxing. "Joseph," she murmured, "surely you have no need to busy yourself with these boxes on such a hot day." She spoke my name in a tone meant to entice, leaning closer than ever before. Her intention was unmistakable, and I felt my pulse quicken as she reached out to touch my shoulder. I stepped back, heart pounding, my mind racing to find the right words. I reminded her that I was a servant, that my loyalty belonged to Potiphar. I begged her not to place me in this impossible situation, but she would not listen. She pressed herself nearer, insisting that none would know, that she held the power to ensure my safety and promotion if I complied. A storm of thoughts raged within me, Fear of her power, fear of betraying my master, and fear of betraying my God. Yet I could not yield, not even for a moment. Summoning every ounce of courage, I broke away from her grasp. I gasped words that I hoped would make her realize the weight of her request. My master has entrusted me with everything in this house. He holds back nothing from me except you. How could I commit this wickedness and sin against God? My voice trembled, but my conviction stood firm. In a sudden burst of anger and desperation, she seized my cloak, her grip tight and unyielding. My heart thundered in my chest as I twisted free, leaving the garment in her hands. Barely aware of my surroundings, I fled into the corridor, my feet nearly stumbling in my haste. Even now, I can still feel the heartbeat thudding in my ears, the stark terror that overshadowed every other emotion. I did not know what she would do, only that I had to escape the snare she had laid. It did not take long for me to learn the outcome of that fateful encounter. Moments after my escape, I heard her shrill cries reverberate through the halls. I froze in place, my mind spinning as I realized what she was doing. She was calling for the servants, for the guards, weaving a story in which I was the aggressor. She clutched my cloak like a piece of damning evidence, claiming that I had tried to force myself upon her before she screamed and scared me away. The gravity of her accusation hit me like a physical blow. Any defense I offered would be overshadowed by her status as the lady of the house. In a matter of minutes, the guards seized me. I struggled briefly, searching desperately for some sign that they might listen to my side of the story. But they had their orders. Potiphar's wife had spun her tale so convincingly, complete with the garment she'd torn from me, that they believed her without question. I tried to speak, my words tumbling out in protest, but I knew it was futile. She had orchestrated the perfect trap, and now I was caught in the snare of her deception. When Potiphar arrived, his face was set in fury. He scarcely allowed me a moment to attempt my defense. I saw betrayal and anger in his eyes, as though he could not comprehend how I, the slave he trusted, could repay him in such a manner. My throat constricted with despair, and I felt tears of frustration prick my eyes. Still, I would not beg for mercy, knowing that my innocence rested in the hands of the Almighty. Whatever sentence Potiphar dealt, I knew my conscience was clear before God, though my heart broke to see how easily my reputation was destroyed. Potiphar's judgment was swift and unyielding. I was to be thrown into prison. Not just any prison, but the place where the king's prisoners were held, a place known for its darkness and hopelessness. The guards dragged me away, rough hands gripping my arms, their words laced with contempt. My feet stumbled over the threshold as I looked one last time at the household I had cared for so diligently. Potiphar turned his back, unable or unwilling to hear any further pleas. The clang of iron gates sealed my fate. As the heavy door closed behind me, plunging me into the dimly lit confines of the prison, I felt my hopes crumble like dust. Gone was the home I had helped manage, gone were the small comforts I had found in service, and gone was the relative favor I had enjoyed under Potiphar's roof. In that moment, I felt the weight of injustice threaten to crush my spirit. I was innocent of any wrongdoing, yet I had been condemned by a lie. Doubt assailed me, whispering that perhaps my dreams of destiny had all been illusions, that God had finally abandoned me to the cruelty of circumstance. But in the midst of that darkness, I remembered the faith that had brought me this far. I recalled the countless hours I had spent crying out to the Lord, trusting Him to guide my steps, even when they led to places I never would have chosen. If God could preserve me in the desert and grant me favor in Potiphar's house, perhaps He could also sustain me here within these prison walls. And so, despite the crushing blow of betrayal, I clung to that sliver of hope, knowing that my story was not yet finished. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not abandoned me before. In that dim cell, surrounded by darkness and despair, I resolved that I would hold fast to Him still. When I first arrived at the prison, I found it to be a place devoid of light, both literal and spiritual. The walls were thick stone, offering little air and even less hope, and my fellow inmates moved like shadows, their eyes dulled by resignation. Having already experienced so many abrupt turns of fate, I might have believed that nothing could shock me anymore. Yet the darkness of that dungeon weighed on me more heavily than any burden I had carried before. Still reeling from the lies that had cast me here, I wrestled with a swirl of questions. Why had God allowed this? Had I misread the dreams of my youth? Was I destined to die in obscurity without any chance to clear my name? Despite my inner turmoil, I could not shake the deep-seated conviction that God was with me, even in this bleak pit. I had survived betrayal by my brothers, endured slavery in a foreign land, and gained the trust of a powerful man, only to be slandered and discarded. Somehow, even in the face of these trials, I could not abandon the faith that had carried me so far. Each day, I rose from my ragged bedding on the floor of my cell and whispered silent prayers. Although my soul felt raw with grief and anger, I pleaded for a steadfast spirit, reminding myself that the Lord remains sovereign over my circumstances. As I settled into the punishing rhythms of prison life, I discovered that the warden, though stern, was not without discernment. He took note of how I worked alongside the other prisoners, never shrinking from tasks or complaining beyond the usual groans of exhaustion. I found myself performing the chores I had once overseen in Potiphar's house, cleaning corridors, distributing rations, sometimes even tidying the warden's own rooms. To my surprise, he began assigning me greater responsibilities, trusting my ability to organize and remain honest. Over time, his confidence in me grew, and little by little, I was granted a measure of freedom to move throughout the prison, ensuring that the daily work was accomplished. This favor did not erase my sorrow, nor did it absolve me of the sting of injustice. But it did serve as a reminder that God's hand was still upon me. The hours were long and unremarkable. The smell of damp stone and unwashed bodies clung to every corner, and the moans of desperate men echoed through the corridors. Yet, amidst the gloom, I discovered the smallest flickers of hope in the trust the warden placed in me. Often, I recalled my father's teachings and the truths found in our heritage, that wherever God's people find themselves, they may still honor him by performing their duties faithfully. And so, though my body remained in chains, I determined that my spirit would remain free. It was in that grim setting that two new prisoners arrived, men whose very appearance set them apart from the rest of us. The first was the royal cupbearer, once a trusted servant in Pharaoh's court. The second was the king's baker, whose skill had once graced Pharaoh's table. Whatever transgressions they had committed, real or perceived, Pharaoh had grown angry enough to cast them both into prison. Their fine garments were gone, replaced by worn rags like the rest of us, yet they carried themselves differently than other prisoners. They seemed lost, like men plucked from a life of comfort and power and thrust into a nightmare they could scarcely comprehend. I was assigned to attend them, likely because the warden saw that these men, used to the intrigues of palace life, might need someone more refined than the average convict. Over the following days, I brought them water, food, and blankets. Whenever they asked for something, I did my best to accommodate their requests. They appeared grateful for my efforts, though their eyes often betrayed a deep anxiety about what would happen to them. One evening, I noticed both men wearing troubled expressions. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing around as though they feared someone might overhear. Intrigued, I waited for an opportunity to ask what weighed on them so heavily. The moment presented itself the following morning, when I came upon them pacing restlessly in a small courtyard the warden allowed some prisoners to use. Their brows were furrowed, and they scarcely acknowledged me until I quietly inquired if something was wrong. At first, they exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to trust me. I assured them that I was simply curious, that I had seen them looking distressed and wished to help if I could. The cupbearer, shifting uneasily, finally admitted that each had experienced a disturbing dream the previous night. Neither could make sense of the symbols, and they had no access to the court magicians who might interpret them. In that moment, I recalled my own dreams and the abiding belief that God alone held the power to grant wisdom and interpretation. Something within me stirred, reminding me of the times he had spoken through the visions of my youth. Gathering my courage, I told them that I served a God who reveals the meanings of dreams, not for personal glory but according to his purposes. If they wished, I would attempt to interpret their dreams by appealing to him. They exchanged startled looks, for they were used to the elaborate rituals of Egyptian soothsayers. Yet their desperation outweighed their skepticism, and they nodded for me to proceed. The cupbearer went first, describing a vine with 3 branches that budded, blossomed, and produced clusters of ripe grapes. He said he took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, placing it in Pharaoh's hand. I closed my eyes, silently asking God to guide me, and then I explained that the 3 branches represented 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh would restore the cupbearer to his former position, once again placing Pharaoh's cup into his hand. The man's face brightened at the prospect of returning to favor, and the tension visibly ebbed from his posture. Encouraged by this hopeful interpretation, the baker then recounted his own dream. He had seen himself carrying 3 baskets of baked goods on his head, and in the top basket were all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh. But birds flew down and ate them from the basket. A sinking feeling tugged at my heart, and I felt a deep sorrow on the baker's behalf. I saw clearly, through the understanding given to me, that the 3 baskets likewise represented 3 days. Yet at the end of those days, Pharaoh would not restore him but rather condemn him. The birds devouring the bread signified the terrible fate awaiting him. With a heavy heart, I shared this with the baker, who listened in stunned silence. Both men thanked me in their own ways, though the baker's gratitude was laced with grief. As for the cupbearer, he seemed buoyed by the promise of freedom. I seized the chance to ask him for a kindness. When you are restored to Pharaoh's service, please remember me. Speak of my innocence, for I was stolen from my homeland and falsely accused here. Help me find a chance for freedom. He nodded vigorously, promising that he would do just that. I pressed hope into that promise, hoping it would not be forgotten like so many other pledges made in moments of relief. The next 3 days crawled by, and I found myself wavering between expectation and fear. My heart ached for the baker, who withdrew into himself, resigned to the grim destiny foretold by his dream. Meanwhile, the cupbearer grew more resolute, almost impatient, counting down the hours until his release. Even the other prisoners could sense the tension. On the appointed day, Pharaoh summoned both men to stand before him. Those of us left in the prison watched them depart, uncertain of what news would reach our ears. Sure enough, the dream's interpretations came to pass precisely as the Lord had revealed. The cupbearer was restored to his position, once again placing the cup into Pharaoh's hand. The baker, however, met a bitter end, executed just as the dream had foretold. Word of these events reached me through the whispers of guards and servants. Though my heart was heavy for the baker, I held fast to the hope that the cupbearer would soon speak to Pharaoh on my behalf. Surely, someone who had experienced God's revelation firsthand would keep his word to mention me. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks bled into months, I found no sign that the cupbearer had remembered me. The prison walls felt narrower, the darkness deeper. More than once I was tempted to despair. Could it be that I was doomed to remain here indefinitely, my life a tangled thread in the loom of injustice? Yet I could not shake the certainty that God's purposes were at work even in this season of waiting. Like a seed buried underground, I remained unseen and forgotten by men, but I trusted that the Maker of all things knew precisely where I was. So I continued tending to the tasks assigned me, committed to doing them well. My prayers never ceased. I prayed for the day God would release me from these chains, and I prayed that he would keep my heart from turning bitter in the long wait. Through the gloom of the dungeon and the silence of unmet expectation, I chose to cling to the truth that had sustained me all along. Though men might forget, God would not. And so, in the depth of that prison, I continued to dream, trusting that in time, God would bring his purposes to light. I longed for each new dawn to bring a sign, a message, anything to show that the cupbearer had not forgotten the promise he made. For the first few weeks after he returned to Pharaoh's service, I woke every morning with my heart pounding in anticipation. Perhaps today, I told myself, the guards would unlock my cell and summon me to stand before Pharaoh. Maybe the cupbearer had pleaded my case, explaining how God had revealed the meaning of his dream and spared him from the fate of the baker. I imagined the look on the warden's face as he proudly led me from my prison cell to the halls of power, vindicated at last. But day after day, no such call came. Days slid into weeks, and my initial hope began to wane. Still, I clung stubbornly to the possibility that news traveled slowly or that the cupbearer needed time to gain Pharaoh's ear. I busied myself with my responsibilities, assisting the warden, overseeing supplies, and keeping order among the prisoners. Yet whenever footsteps echoed in the corridor, I felt my heart leap, only to deflate when it was merely a guard on a routine check or another hapless soul being cast into our midst. In my sleepless nights, I replayed the cupbearer's dream in my mind, recalling the vivid symbols and how God had granted me insight to interpret them. I was sure that the Almighty had orchestrated those events so that I might find my own freedom in return. Surely such a plan would not be abandoned. But the weeks stretched on, and the cupbearer seemed to have vanished from my life as thoroughly as if he had never existed. My heart began to ache with disappointment. It was not the first time I had tasted betrayal. My own brothers had cast me into a pit. but the sting of being forgotten felt like a slow, relentless ache rather than a sudden blow. I thought of how earnestly the cupbearer had thanked me. He had looked me in the eye and sworn to speak of me to Pharaoh. Yet, in the comfort of his regained position, he had allowed my plight to slip from his mind. As the months turned into years, a dull resignation seeped into my bones. What if I was never released? The thick stone walls of this dungeon, cold and grim, became my entire world. The meager daylight that filtered through high, barred windows seemed only to mock me, a reminder of the life that continued beyond these walls, lives of men who could walk freely, breathe fresh air, and gaze upon the open sky. I drifted through my duties on a tide of weary acceptance, fighting a mounting bitterness that threatened to corrode my spirit from within. In my darker moments, I found myself struggling with anger at the cupbearer for his neglect, anger at my brothers for their treachery, and, most unsettling of all, anger at God for allowing me to languish in this place. I knew such anger was dangerous, a poison that could eat away at my faith. I tried to combat it by remembering the times God had shown me favor. In Potiphar's house, and even here in prison, where the warden had granted me responsibilities I never dreamed possible for a condemned man. Despite my burdens, there were moments when I sensed his presence still with me. Yet those moments felt like droplets of water upon a parched desert, too few and far between to quench my thirst for hope. Sometimes I would find a quiet corner and close my eyes, recalling my childhood dreams of sheaves bowing and stars paying homage. Back then, I had believed with all my heart that God had a plan of greatness for me. I was so certain those visions were real, guiding me toward a destiny I could not fully comprehend. How was I to reconcile those dreams with my present reality, shackled, forgotten, and alone? Was it possible I had misunderstood the message of those dreams? Had my own pride clouded their true meaning? Late into the night, such questions haunted my thoughts, eroding what little confidence I still held. Yet, in the midst of my turmoil, I found that simple acts of kindness offered small rays of light. I continued to help the warden maintain order, treating the other prisoners with compassion when possible. Many were hardened men, burdened by guilt or fury at the circumstances that brought them here. Some lashed out in violence. Others withdrew into themselves, haunted by their own regrets. But whenever the chance arose, I tried to ease their suffering, offering a soothing word or sharing a portion of my meager rations with those who had none. In time, a few came to trust me to speak of their pasts and their fears. Although I had no power to free them, I hoped to lighten their loads, just as I yearned for someone to lighten mine. The slow drip of time began to dull my senses, yet I clung to prayer like a drowning man grasps for driftwood. There were evenings I felt my prayers were little more than sighs and groans, wordless pleas for deliverance from the silence. I found myself constantly wrestling with the notion that God might have abandoned me, though some deeper part of me persisted in believing otherwise. I recalled stories my father used to tell, how our forefather Abraham waited long years for a promised son, how Isaac had faced famine, how Jacob had endured strife with Laban. Each of them had moments when God's promises seemed distant, yet in the end, his faithfulness never faltered. Still the doubts pressed in. What if I were the exception to that long heritage of God's redemption? What if I died in these prison walls, my dreams unfulfilled? Each new year felt like another nail sealing the coffin of my former aspirations. And whenever the memory of the cupbearer's face crossed my mind, I felt a surge of wounded anger. How easily men forget those who have helped them when they're once again in comfort and safety. There came a time when I no longer counted the passing weeks. My body grew accustomed to the unchanging rhythm of prison life, to the clang of iron gates, to the flickering torchlight that cast dancing shadows on the cold stones at night. I sometimes wondered if the outside world had changed beyond recognition or if my father still lived. I recalled the look of sorrow on his face whenever he feared for my safety. If only he knew how far I had fallen. My brothers, too, did they carry guilt for their actions or had they convinced themselves that I was gone for good? The weight of these thoughts often threatened to crush what remained of my hope. Yet amid the slow erosion of my dreams, I sensed a quiet undercurrent, a gentle prompting that whispered I was not alone. I could not see it or hold it, but something deep within told me that though men might forget, God does not. This certainty stirred me to remain diligent in my tasks, to offer comfort where I could, and to keep my heart tender rather than letting it grow hard and bitter. Perhaps this was the ultimate test, whether I would choose despair or continued faith in a God whose timeline I could not comprehend. Though the darkness pressed in and the silence of unanswered prayers gnawed at my spirit, I resolved to continue trusting that my life still mattered to him. Every time I found myself wondering if my body would someday be carried out of these walls for burial, I would recall the stories of how the Lord delivered our ancestors at precisely the right moment. The difference now was I had no idea when or if my moment would come. I only knew I could not betray the God I had served all my life by giving up in bitterness and anger. And so, in that quiet prison where time seemed to stand still, I found the endurance to live day by day. I would rise before the other prisoners, performing my duties with steady hands, refusing to let resentment consume me. Yes, I felt forgotten by the cupbearer, neglected by the world, and sorely tested by God's silence. But still I prayed, still I believed, and still I hoped, though that hope was now a fragile, flickering ember in the cold chambers of my heart. Day by weary day, year by agonizing year, I held on to the faint belief that one day God would remember me, even if every other living soul had already let me go. Day after day in that bleak prison, I had settled into a resigned routine. The walls seemed as eternal as the troubles that had chained me there. Yet on one morning I will never forget, everything changed. I was going about my usual duties, checking on the other inmates and taking an inventory of the storeroom, when a guard burst in, his expression urgent. He scarcely paused to bark out my name before pulling me away, ignoring the startled questions of my fellow prisoners. My heart thundered, for I had no idea what new calamity might have befallen me. Was I to be punished further or exiled to a worse cell? But the guard spoke only of speed. Make haste. Pharaoh has summoned you. At first I thought I must have misheard. Why would Pharaoh, the ruler of all Egypt, demand to see a Hebrew slave languishing in a dungeon? I hardly dared to ask for clarification, lest I betray how rattled I was by the unexpected development. My mind whirled. Could it be the cupbearer had finally remembered me? Hope flared, tempered by caution. In the corridor, guards ushered me along at a near run, leading me away from the familiar darkness of the prison and up into the brightness of the palace grounds. My eyes stung from the sudden flood of sunlight. The air felt different too, fresher, scented with lilies and incense, a sharp contrast to the stale gloom I had known for so long. I was brought to a chamber where attendants waited with water and razors. Before I could ask questions, they stripped away my tattered garments, washed the grime from my hair, and shaved me clean. They worked briskly, speaking in low voices about Pharaoh's recent turmoil. Something about disturbing dreams, repeated nightly and beyond the skill of the court magicians to interpret. I felt a jolt of recognition. Dreams. My heart pounded with anticipation. Could this be the Lord's way of restoring me, of proving that he had not abandoned me to be forgotten in the bowels of a prison? Arrayed in fine linen, a borrowed splendor that felt alien against my skin, I was led through the palace halls, each more opulent than the last, until we reached the throne room. There, surrounded by courtiers and guarded by massive columns, stood Pharaoh himself. I could scarcely breathe. Though I had once managed Potiphar's estate, I had never glimpsed such grandeur. The very air seemed charged with power. Yet I reminded myself that all authority ultimately belonged to God, not to any human ruler. Steadying my nerves, I bowed low, careful to show respect, for my life hung on Pharaoh's goodwill. Pharaoh's voice, tense with worry, echoed across the chamber. "I have been told," he began, "that you can interpret dreams. My servants say there is a spirit of wisdom in you." I felt every gaze turned toward me, but I did not let pride or fear guide my response. Bowing my head, I answered humbly, "It is not in me to interpret, my lord, but God himself will grant Pharaoh a favorable answer." A murmur rippled among the assembled nobles, but Pharaoh merely inclined his head. Then he described his two baffling dreams, each marked by startling imagery. First, 7 healthy cows emerged from the Nile, only to be devoured by 7 gaunt cows. Next, 7 full ears of grain were swallowed by 7 thin, scorched ears. As Pharaoh spoke, I sensed a stirring in my spirit, the same unmistakable warmth of divine insight I had experienced years earlier. It was as though God whispered clarity into my mind. The 7 healthy cows and 7 full ears of grain symbolized 7 years of abundant harvest, while the 7 gaunt cows and thin ears represented 7 years of devastating famine. Summoning my courage, I relayed this to Pharaoh, speaking boldly. I explained that the repetition of the dream meant the matter was firmly decided by God, and that Pharaoh must prepare swiftly. Shock flickered across the faces of the courtiers, but Pharaoh's dark eyes remained fixed on mine as though weighing every word. When I finished, a hush fell over the throne room. One could almost hear hearts pounding at the severity of the news. I sensed a question forming in Pharaoh's mind, so I pressed on, suggesting that a wise and discerning man be appointed to oversee the gathering of surplus grain during the 7 years of plenty. That grain would then be stored in reserve so that, when the 7 years of famine arrived, Egypt would have enough to sustain itself, and likely profit from selling to neighboring lands. My voice trembled slightly at the daring of advising the king, yet I felt compelled to give him the full counsel I believed God intended. An electric current seemed to pass through the assembly. Pharaoh turned to his officials, a thoughtful expression creasing his brow. Murmurs spread, some voices skeptical, others impressed by the clarity of my words. At last, Pharaoh lifted a hand and silence fell once more. He locked eyes with me and I caught a glimmer of something like awe. "Where can we find another man like this, in whom the Spirit of God dwells?" he asked, though it sounded more like a declaration than a question. No one dared to answer. Then Pharaoh turned fully toward me. "Since God has revealed all this to you, there is no one as wise or discerning. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall obey your commands. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." The chamber erupted in gasps and whispers. I stood stunned, scarcely able to process the magnitude of Pharaoh's words. This was more than a reprieve from prison. It was a catapult to the highest seat of power beneath Pharaoh himself. My mouth felt dry and I stammered out my gratitude, bowing low as if my legs might buckle beneath me. Pharaoh motioned for his servants to bring fine robes, a signet ring bearing his seal, and a gold chain. Before my astonished eyes, they placed these royal tokens upon me, marking me as a ruler in Egypt. I remembered my father's gift of a many-colored coat, back when I was a mere boy dreaming of greatness. Never could I have imagined a scene like this, decked in garments of state at Pharaoh's side. All the while, my heart pounded with a heady mix of joy and trepidation. A swirl of memories engulfed me: my brother's betrayal, Potiphar's household, the prison cell where I languished for so many years. Now, in the blink of an eye, I was being raised to a rank that defied every hardship I had suffered. Yet I knew this ascension was not my doing. God himself had placed me here to fulfill a purpose beyond my understanding. I could sense that my new role was not merely a reward but a profound responsibility, one I must carry out with humility and diligence. Pharaoh, seemingly eager to commence this plan for Egypt's survival, directed me to make preparations at once. His officials, though stunned, quickly offered cautious bows to me, recognizing that I now held authority above them all. My mind whirled with the practical tasks ahead: establishing granaries, organizing labor, drafting instructions on how to gather and store surplus grain. Somewhere beneath this flood of thoughts, I felt the pang of recalling the pain of the prison and the memory of the cupbearer's broken promise. But there was no time for bitterness now. God had acted in a way I had never anticipated, raising me from a pit of despair to a place of influence that could save countless lives. In a daze, I followed Pharaoh's attendants out of the throne room. My newly bestowed regalia felt both weighty and foreign, a symbol of a destiny I still struggled to believe was mine. Everywhere I turned, people bowed or stepped aside, murmuring my new title as though testing it on their tongues. I prayed silently for wisdom, knowing that I was only a man, and a Hebrew man at that, in a foreign land. How could I manage such a daunting task unless the Lord himself guided me? Yet as I was shown my new quarters and introduced to various overseers, I felt an abiding peace settle over me. At long last, I understood that all the trials, every betrayal, every false accusation, every year in prison, had shaped me for this moment. God's plan was unfolding in the halls of power, and I was his servant to enact it. My voice would direct the might of Egypt, and my faith would be tested as never before. But for the first time in years, I felt the sun of hope shining on my face without shadow. I was Joseph, once a dreamer in a distant land, once a slave in Potiphar's house, once a prisoner in the darkest dungeon, now called forth to stand beside Pharaoh himself, entrusted with the fate of a nation. I often look back on those early days after Pharaoh appointed me as overseer, recalling the flurry of activity as we stored grain during the 7 years of abundance. The fields of Egypt yielded so much that we ran out of places to put it all, and my scribes lost track of the endless stacks in the granaries. We built new storehouses, hired more workers, and strove day and night to gather and record the surplus. Though no one knew how severe the coming famine might be, I felt a weight on my shoulders, an urgency to prepare for what God had revealed. I poured my heart into that task, determined that not one kernel of grain would go to waste. My name had spread throughout Egypt, and many spoke of me as a man guided by divine insight. Yet they did not know the years of hardship that had forged my resolve. When the lean years finally arrived, I witnessed the land of Egypt withering under the relentless sun. Crops failed, rivers and tributaries ran low, and animals grew thin. The once bustling markets turned into forlorn spaces where desperate people crowded in search of grain. Through Pharaoh's edict, they came directly to me. I oversaw the distribution, selling the stored surplus back to the people at a fair price. Thanks to the detailed plan God had guided me to implement, Egypt was not only surviving, it was also becoming a refuge for those beyond our borders. Word spread that grain could be found in Egypt, drawing people from other lands who arrived starving and penniless, hoping for mercy. I sometimes caught myself remembering my boyhood dreams when I saw foreigners bowing before me, pleading for food. Those hazy images from years ago, the sheaves and the stars, sparked a strange ache in my heart. Life had taught me painful lessons since those carefree days under my father's tent. I had suffered betrayal, enslavement, and imprisonment. Yet God had woven each thread into this present tapestry, placing me in a position to save not only Egyptians but countless others as well. Despite all my responsibilities, a restlessness gnawed at me when I thought of my family. My father, my younger brother Benjamin, what had become of them? Though I was a powerful man, I was still a son with unanswered questions about the home I had lost. One afternoon, while I was seated at my official station to oversee the sale of grain, a commotion erupted near the entrance. I noticed a group of men kneeling amid the throngs, waiting for permission to approach. There was nothing extraordinary about their clothes. They looked like weary travelers from Canaan, dusty from the road. But something stirred deep within me, a tug of recognition that made my pulse quicken. I studied their faces, and a tumult of emotions churned in my chest. They were my brothers, the very men who had cast me into a pit so many years before. I felt both an overwhelming longing to rush and reveal myself, and a surge of anger at the memories of betrayal. My heart pounded as I recalled the terror of that day, their cold, merciless eyes. Part of me wanted to shout for the guards to seize them. Another part wanted to fall on my knees and weep that my flesh and blood stood before me at last. Yet I could not allow these warring impulses to show. I was now second only to Pharaoh, and the eyes of Egypt were upon me. For a moment I took a breath, steadying my nerves. Then I remembered that God had brought me to this place not merely to survive, but to serve a greater purpose. I thought of the sorrow in my father's face when I was a boy. If I revealed myself too soon, would my brothers retreat into deceit? Had they changed at all? I resolved to test them to see if their hearts were the same as when they sold me for silver. Summoning the guards, I instructed them to bring the strangers before me. My brothers approached, bowing low, exactly as in my old dream. Their voices trembled when they spoke, explaining in halting Egyptian that they had journeyed from Canaan, seeking to purchase grain because the famine ravaged their land. My translator relayed each word, but I hardly needed his service. Though I pretended ignorance, I could understand them perfectly. They did not recognize me in my Egyptian finery and speaking a foreign tongue. Their ignorance allowed me a chance to probe their intentions. "What is your business here?" I demanded through the translator, forcing my voice to sound stern. They answered that they were honest men, all sons of one father, and had come to buy grain. Hearing them say, "honest men," nearly made me choke with bitterness. Where was that honesty when they threw me into a pit? My anger flashed momentarily, and I accused them of being spies. They babbled in protest, each trying to defend their innocence. They insisted their father was still alive and one brother remained at home. My pulse quickened at the mention of Benjamin. My beloved youngest brother was alive. A swirl of relief mingled with longing and sorrow for the years we had lost. But I did not let my emotion show. Instead, I declared that I would test their words. If they were truly telling the truth, they must bring their youngest brother here to confirm their story. I threatened that if they did not comply, they would be treated as enemies. My translator's voice rang loud and final. The men trembled, exchanging fearful glances. They pleaded, claiming their father would be heartbroken if they did not return soon. My own heart softened at the mention of my father, but I kept my expression steeled. After a moment of feigned deliberation, I demanded that one of them remain behind as a hostage, while the rest returned home to fetch their youngest brother. Only then would I believe they were not spies. I could see the confusion and panic clouding their faces. One of them, Reuben, whispered something to the others in Hebrew. He spoke of guilt, recalling their cruelty to me all those years ago. Though I acted impassive, my chest clenched to hear them express regret. They believed these hardships to be a punishment for my supposed death. They spoke of hearing my pleas and ignoring them. My throat tightened as I pretended not to understand. At that moment, I had to turn away to compose myself. The flood of memories, the pit, the caravan, my cries for mercy, threatened to unravel my composure. I returned, stone-faced, and had Simeon bound before their eyes. They watched in horror as their brother was taken away. Then I gave them the grain they needed, instructing them once again to return with this youngest brother they spoke of. Only by meeting him would I allow them safe passage and the chance to redeem Simeon. They left in a swirl of dust and fear, taking with them the sacks of grain they had purchased. I had ordered my steward to secretly return their silver, hiding it in each sack to confound them further. The moment they were gone, I sank onto a bench, my head in my hands. I had yearned to see my family for so long, yet nothing about this reunion felt joyous. Instead, I was consumed by conflicting emotions. Relief that they lived, anger at their past betrayal, sorrow for the years stolen from us, and worry for my father's health. Had their hearts changed? Did they regret their actions, or did their pleas merely reflect self-preservation? And what of Benjamin? Could I dare to hope my younger brother would stand before me soon, allowing me at last to see some spark of love from my family? In the weeks that followed, I busied myself with the unending task of managing the famine relief. Yet my thoughts repeatedly drifted toward my homeland. I prayed for guidance, for courage to continue this test, and for the strength to confront the bitterness that still lingered in my soul. It felt as though God had placed me on a knife's edge, balancing justice and mercy. I had to ensure the well-being of my father and my brother, to see if my other siblings were truly changed. But each day that passed brought a fresh ache. How long before they returned? Though I held power in Egypt, my heart remained bound by the same question that had haunted me from the day of my betrayal. Did my brother see me as more than a helpless youth to be discarded? Now was the moment to discover the truth. And while fear gnawed at me, a sliver of hope took root, believing that God's plan still stretched ahead in ways I could neither predict nor control. One thing was certain. My past had found me here, in the seat of Egyptian authority, and I would have to face it head-on. The famine had brought my brothers back into my life, and I knew that everything was about to change again. I remember the moment I glimpsed my brothers returning to Egypt as though it happened only yesterday. My steward had told me they had come back, bringing their youngest brother, Benjamin, just as I had demanded. Although my heart thudded at the thought of seeing Benjamin again, I concealed my excitement behind the cool demeanor of a high-ranking Egyptian official. In truth, I wanted nothing more than to run to him, to hold him tight, and to assure him that his older brother was still alive. But I had spent years waiting and preparing for a moment like this, and I knew I must keep my composure for a little longer. My brothers bowed low when they entered my presence, each of them visibly anxious. Benjamin stood among them, looking both nervous and curious, his face so like our mother's that it nearly undid me. I inquired after their father, hoping to hear that he yet lived, and they assured me he was well, though old and weary. The mention of my father jolted 1,000 memories loose, but I kept my voice steady, speaking through my interpreter as though I understood not a word of their Hebrew. I invited them to dine with me that evening, a gesture that left them puzzled but hopeful that this stern Egyptian lord had warmed to them at last. At the banquet, my servants arranged the brothers in order of their birth, a small detail that made them exchange astonished glances, wondering how I could possibly know the exact sequence of their ages. I lavished portions upon Benjamin, a sign of favor that did not go unnoticed. All the while, I wrestled with a storm of emotions inside. I could see they were perplexed. Why was this Egyptian minister treating them so strangely? Yet I was not ready to reveal my identity. Not just yet. I had to be certain of the sincerity of their hearts. The final test came the next morning, when I quietly instructed my steward to hide my personal silver cup in Benjamin's sack. After they departed, content with grain for the journey home, I ordered my steward to pursue them. He accused them of thievery and searched their sacks. When the cup was discovered in Benjamin's bag, their despair was palpable. They were forced to return, trembling, to stand before me once more. For a moment, I relived the panic of my own betrayal, how I had pleaded with them from the depths of that pit so many years ago. But this time, instead of casting Benjamin aside to save themselves, they rallied around him, each protesting his innocence. Their voices rang with genuine fear and concern for our youngest brother, who stood trembling at their side. Finally, Judah stepped forward, speaking words that tore at my soul. He offered himself in Benjamin's place, begging me not to take away the only remaining child of our father's beloved wife. I listened, astonished, as he poured out a heartfelt plea, describing how my father would surely die of grief if Benjamin did not return. He spoke of the guilt they all carried over another son once lost. He described how they had witnessed their father's sorrow grow year by year, like a wound that would not heal. Hearing these words, I felt the final barrier in my heart crumble. They were no longer the same men who had callously sold me into slavery. Their remorse was genuine, and their love for our father, and for Benjamin, was undeniable. Overwhelmed, I could no longer maintain my facade. I dismissed every Egyptian servant from the room, unwilling to let them witness the eruption of emotion I felt surging within. My brothers stood before me, confused and fearful. In that hushed moment, I felt tears stinging my eyes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. All the anger, sorrow, and longing I had carried for so many years rose to the surface. It was as if the many-colored robe my father once gave me, the coat I had been stripped of, were draped upon my shoulders again, reminding me of who I truly was. The words tumbled out before I could contain them. "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" My voice cracked, echoing off the walls. My brothers stared at me, their faces blanched. It was as though time itself had frozen, condensing the years of pain, questions, and secrets into that single, piercing revelation. For a moment, none of them spoke. I saw flashes of recognition dart across their expressions, eyes wide, mouths parted in shock. Some reflex made them step backward as if I might strike them down for their past cruelty. But I no longer held anger in my heart. I only felt an overpowering rush of relief that we stood in the same room once more, living and breathing after all these years. Tears streamed down my cheeks and I struggled to steady my voice. "Please come closer," I urged, though they seemed rooted to the floor in their astonishment. Slowly, one by one, they approached, uncertainty in their eyes. I saw in their faces the children they once were, the boys who played in the fields and ran laughing after the flocks. We had aged, endured so much, but the bond of family had never truly died. Despite the betrayal, despite the heartbreak, here we stood, miraculously brought together again by the hand of God. Gently, I reached for Benjamin first. He was trembling, unable to believe the stranger before him was the brother he had only heard about in childhood stories. We fell into each other's arms, and a sob tore from my throat that felt as though it had been pent up for decades. He clung to me, his tears soaking into my fine Egyptian robes, and I stroked his hair, whispering, "I have missed you so much, my brother." My heart ached for all the lost years we should have shared. Though I could never recover those seasons of youth, I offered silent thanks that we had at least this moment and hopefully the future. Then I turned to my other brothers. They stood uneasy, clearly expecting wrath. Yet something deeper than vengeance guided me. God had brought good from the evil done to me, using my trials to place me where I could save many lives. I embraced them one by one, my tears mixing with theirs. No words could have fully expressed the flood of emotions I felt: relief, forgiveness, renewed love. In those embraces, the walls of resentment came crashing down. I saw their remorse was real, and I felt the chains of bitterness break away from my soul. Eventually, our voices returned to us. My brothers struggled to form words of apology, but I shook my head, urging them not to be distressed or angry with themselves. "What you intended for harm," I told them, "God has used for good. He sent me ahead of you to preserve life." My tears had slowed, but my heart still felt raw. We stood huddled together like men returning from a battlefield, wounded yet alive, bound by a shared history of pain and regret. I asked them again about our father, my throat closing at the thought of his reaction once he learned I still lived. They assured me he was in Canaan, grieving these many years for the son he believed lost forever. I insisted they must hurry back to him with the news. I would provide every means for them to travel in comfort and bring him, and all our family, down to Egypt. where they would be safe from the famine. My newfound authority, given by Pharaoh's own decree, would ensure they lacked nothing. I pictured my father's face lighting up at the sight of us united, and I nearly broke down again at the thought of embracing him once more. When at last the turmoil of weeping and wonder subsided, I summoned my steward back into the room. He found us all red-eyed and shaken but strangely radiant. I instructed him to make preparations for a caravan. The steward, who knew only part of the story, seemed puzzled but obeyed without question. Meanwhile, my brothers stared at me in something like awe, as though still unsure if this was real or a dream. I led them to dine in a more intimate setting, urging them to share every detail of what had transpired in Canaan since I was taken from them. They, in turn, begged to hear my story, though I spared them some of the harsher details of my years in slavery and imprisonment. That day felt like waking from a nightmare into the gentle light of morning. Where bitterness might have thrived, only forgiveness and renewed love could take root. I marveled at the unexpected paths God's plan had taken, guiding me from a pit in Canaan to a position of authority in Egypt, and now reuniting me with the very brothers who once tore our family apart. Though years of separation still lingered in our eyes, a new chapter began in the heart of that Egyptian palace. It was as if the dreams of my youth, those symbols of sheaves and stars, were fulfilled not in condemnation but in reconciliation. I realized more than ever that God's designs were beyond my comprehension, yet always far more wondrous than I could have imagined. I often find myself reflecting on the winding road that brought me to this place. When I think back to the day my father gave me that multicolored coat, so vibrant, so full of promise, I realize now that it was more than a garment. It was the first sign of a destiny unfolding. At the time, all I could see was the warmth of my father's love and the envy in my brother's eyes. But if I trace every thread of my story through betrayal and slavery, through prison and Pharaoh's palace, I see how God gently wove all of it into a tapestry of mercy. He took the darkest circumstances and turned them into blessings, not just for me but for countless others. When I stood in front of Pharaoh's throne, interpreting dreams that foretold a devastating famine, I had no idea how that chain of events would eventually bring my entire family under one roof again. The heartbreak I endured, being thrown into a pit and sold to strangers, became the very avenue by which I learned to trust God's hand, even when I couldn't see the path. Each sorrow led me to a deeper understanding of faith, each injustice prodding me toward a compassionate heart. There was no instant revelation that made it all clear at once. Rather, it was in the gradual unveiling of events that I recognized the Lord's fingerprints in every chapter of my journey. For a long time, I struggled to understand how my youthful dreams of leadership could align with the pain of slavery. I felt abandoned in Potiphar's house, then doubly so in prison, especially after being falsely accused. My faith was tested to the point of despair. Yet, in that crucible of suffering, my reliance on God became unshakable. Every favor I received, from gaining Potiphar's trust to earning the warden's confidence, felt like a small but vital reassurance that God had not forgotten me. I learned patience the hard way, day by day, as I waited for a rescue only heaven could orchestrate. When, at last, I was lifted out of the shadows to interpret Pharaoh's troubling dreams, I realized how meticulously God had prepared me for that moment. My prior experiences, managing Potiphar's estate, organizing prison affairs, were stepping stones. By the time I took charge of storing grain throughout Egypt, I was no stranger to responsibility and planning. In the depths of my heart, I understood that every trial had shaped me. God does not waste our suffering. Instead, He forges it into tools for His work. And the famine itself, devastating as it was, became the reason my brothers would walk back into my life. Seeing them bow before me as strangers, pleading for food, stirred every emotion: pain, anger, love, and longing. It was hard not to resent them for what they did, but my tears revealed that the bonds of family and faith ran deeper than bitterness. Still, I needed to know if their hearts had changed. I tested them, placing them in difficult positions, observing whether they would abandon one another as they had once abandoned me. The sight of Judah begging for Benjamin's life, willing to sacrifice himself, was the final crack in my guarded heart. Here were men transformed by remorse, bound by love for our Father and for each other. The moment I revealed my identity, declaring, "I am Joseph," remains etched in my memory like a miracle. Seeing the shock on their faces, followed by relief and then tears of remorse, was like a healing balm. We wept and clung to one another, the distance of years collapsing in a single embrace. In that moment, I realized that God's hand had been upon us all along, even when we were consumed by grief and hatred. My brother's betrayal was undeniable, but so was God's grace, using our brokenness for a far greater purpose than any of us could have foreseen. Welcoming my father to Egypt was the culmination of that redemptive arc. When he first set eyes on me, alive and flourishing in Pharaoh's court, words failed us both. We simply held each other and let tears speak for us. I thought of all the nights he must have spent grieving for the child he believed lost, the emptiness he must have felt. And I thought of the heartbreak I carried, imagining he might have passed away without ever knowing the truth. To stand before him once more, no longer a boy but a man entrusted with the welfare of an entire nation, felt like stepping fully into God's promise. I arranged for my family to settle in Goshen, a fertile region in Egypt where they could tend their flocks and be close to me. Pharaoh himself offered his blessing, acknowledging that the same wisdom which saved Egypt could sustain my own people. As I rode out to greet them in their new home, watching them unload their belongings and settle among the green pastures, I felt an overwhelming gratitude. The famine still gripped the land, but because of our foresight and God's guidance, we had enough to feed not just Egyptians, but also my family and many others seeking refuge. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if I had chosen vengeance instead of reconciliation. What if, in my anger, I had simply thrown my brothers into prison or sent them away empty-handed? It's a chilling thought. I might have fed the bitterness that once threatened to consume me, missing out on the profound healing God intended. In choosing forgiveness, I found freedom, not only for myself but for my brothers as well. It became clear that love and mercy triumph where revenge only breeds more pain. In my final reflections, I see how God's invisible hand guided me through every detour and delay. The path was strewn with challenges, some caused by human cruelty, others by inevitable hardship, but not one step was wasted. Each disappointment taught me humility, each triumph encouraged faith, each loss spurred gratitude. Where I once stood proud in a coat of many colors, dreaming of grandeur, I now stand humbled by God's mercy, grateful for the chance to serve and protect those who once did me harm. The lessons I carry are simple yet profound. Trust God when no path seems open, forgive those who have wronged you, and remain faithful in every task, no matter how small. These are the seeds that grow into great harvests, the quiet acts of faith that move mountains. Looking back, I see a story that only the Almighty could have written. A story of betrayal turned to blessing, despair turned to deliverance, and shattered dreams turned to saving visions. My life is proof that even when everything seems lost, God can bring about a greater good than we ever imagined. And so, here in Egypt, surrounded by my father, my brothers, and the rich tapestry of events that brought us to this place, I find peace. Yes, the famine rages, but we stand united as a family, sheltering under the God who works all things together for good. I once yearned to return to my father's tent as a cherished son, yet God had something far more expansive in mind. I no longer doubt his timing or methods. I simply yield to the truth that his ways surpass our understanding. In every valley, in every triumph, his hand has guided me, and for that I will forever give thanks.